Hey everybody, I'm bringing you chapter 20 from the Amsco book, Becoming a World Power, 1898 to 1917. So this is a big chapter because it talks a lot about foreign policy, and it's something that we haven't really covered. But that's going to be a major focus for us, is thinking about what we think of as foreign policy before the Spanish-American War and afterwards. So this is going to be a real pivot point for the United States in that we're engaging in foreign affairs way more than we did previously, or did we, right? So we're going to answer that question at the end of this video. One thing that I want to bring to you guys is that the issues that we were talking about domestically with segregation, racism, anti-Semitic, or sorry, anti-Chinese attitudes, all of this stuff is still around. And this cartoon, I show this cartoon in order to better contextualize what's going on at home versus what's going on abroad. So we have a figure here looking at a map that says the Philippine Islands. We have somebody standing here that name is Justice on the staff that they're holding, or it's a sword. And in the back, we have African Americans being lynched. So what this is referring to here is that this is McKinley looking at the Philippine Islands, and the quote here is that civilization begins at home. So the main argument here is while the US was pursuing a foreign policy intended on civilizing the countries like the Philippines, African Americans were still subjected to violence and intimidation by white terrorists. Therefore, the United States becomes hypocritical in their pursuit of civilization. So beginning before the Spanish-American War, we have the expansionist policies, the policies of America reaching out a little bit more. Seward, Alaska, and the French in Mexico. William Seward was one of the most influential secretaries of state. He served under Lincoln, and Seward led the drive to annex the Midway Islands in the Pacific. The Midway Islands later become a battle theater in World War II. But Seward negotiated the purchase of Alaska from Russia. And France attempted to occupy Mexico, but the U.S. threatened military action, and France backed down. Again, sort of stretching that Monroe Doctrine down in Mexico, which is going to play a larger role later on. Within the purchase of Alaska, Russia was willing to sell Alaska due to threats of takeover from Great Britain, and Seward negotiated the purchase for $7.2 million. Most people saw it as a waste. They called it Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, but that actually proved to be wrong considering how much oil and gold that they found later on. So this new form of imperialism that we're going to see after the purchase of Alaska, is that U.S. industrialization fueled the need for raw materials and for worldwide markets. Overseas territories might offer a safety valve for unhappiness and the concerns from the Panic of 1893, labor management disputes, and farming crises. We're going to get into later about what was the actual fuel for the imperialist. What actually fueled the imperialist desires. Expansionists want to use economic and diplomatic means mostly versus military action, although we will take some military action later on. And we see Colombia here trying on the hat of world power, checking it out to see how it looks on herself. We do see down off of her belt here, we see a watch, we see a purse, we see a bayonet, and we see a cannon. So these are the things that she's willing to use to go along with this hat of world power. International Darwinism, so broader context for imperialism here. We saw the competition for territories for military advantage and what we're calling spheres of influence. Within the American theater, we can think of this as an extension of manifest destiny. But other countries like Britain, France, and Germany and Russia also wanted to extend their influence. There were Christian missionaries being sent into the continents of Africa and in countries like Asia, and the continent of Asia. And we had one Reverend Josiah Strong in Our Country claim that the people of Anglo-Saxon stock were the fittest to survive. Anglo-Saxon is referring to the English stock, right? Anglo-English Saxon stock were the fittest to survive. fitting into that social Darwinism that we talked a lot about with the rise of the business interests. In America, some Americans felt like they had religious duty to spread Christianity and civilization. And missionaries traveled to Africa and Asia, believing in this racial superiority. So, this makes me think of going all the way back to those debates within the Spanish of how to treat Native Americans, the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. Do we consider them, because do we consider them human? Do we consider them as equal to us? Can we save their souls? And it seems like in the late 1800s, the Americans and the Europeans were having a similar dilemma. How do we treat these people that we intend to conquer, really? But yet we have this face of the idea of spreading religion. So the basic politics of this is that Republican politicians wanted to expand. So Republicans wanted to do it. Democrats were typically anti-expansionist. And Henry Cabot Lodge was one example of a Republican. Theodore Roosevelt's going to play a prominent role in this expansionist policy. So I found this ad. It says the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. So in this advertisement, we have a naval officer look at it down here on the right, we see giving this characterized as it looks like an indigenous person of some island, giving them soap to bring them civilization. So we have the military policy, the foreign policy, the economic policy, all tied up into one advertisement here. So in terms of naval power, we have Alfred Thayer Mahan. Mahan advocated that a strong navy was necessary for securing markets and becoming a world power. And this book that he wrote, the Influence of Sea Power on History, convinced lawmakers to invest in a navy. And the other thing that that they factored into this was that the acquisition of islands in the Pacific were used as fueling stations so that ships can safely get to China without running into trouble. So within the Latin American policy, we're going to be talking a lot about how America dealt with Latin America. And of course, it began with the Monroe Doctrine, was the idea that Europe should not intervene in Latin America, in South and Central America, and that the United States would not intervene in Europe. And to this end, Benjamin Harris's Secretary of State, James Blaine, formed a permanent organization for trade, hoping to bring down tariffs among the Latin American countries. Grover Cleveland and his Secretary of State only they negotiated a boundary dispute between Venezuela and Guyana, and Cleveland insisted that Great Britain negotiate, and Great Britain basically said it wasn't any of their business, and the U.S. backed up their position with the threat of force. So we see Cleveland there standing, holding the lion's tail. The lion is Great Britain, restraining them from intervening in Venezuela and Guyana. In the Spanish-American War, the Caribbean was the most nearby target for American investment in Cuban sugar. There was also some Spanish misrule, and again, this Monroe Doctrine is playing a role. The causes of the war broadly. So there was this idea of jingoism, aggressive policy brought on by nationalism, and in that the United States was also competing with Europe for territories. So specifically to the Spanish-American War, Cuba revolted unsuccessfully in 1895 from Spain. Spain responded by sending troops, and the General Weyler, the Butcher, and 100,000 troops, where there was claims to be atrocities committed on the Cuban people. And it was promoted by the yellow journalism. The New York World and New York Journal printed sensationalist and false accounts of these Spanish atrocities. There was also this Delome letter where the Spanish minister to the U.S. was being critical of McKinley, and that was publicized as a stain on American reputation. Here we see this New York Journal on the right describing the sinking of the Maine. It says, destruction of the Maine was the work of an enemy. And then it goes on to say, naval officers think the Maine was destroyed by a Spanish mine. But yet it's offering evidence it's offering a reward for evidence in support of that claim. So they really took a dubious claim that didn't really have any evidence, and they put it out there, when in fact it was most likely caused by an accident. But this battleship was stationed in Cuba, and it exploded, and the blame was put on Spain. Here we see a depiction of, we have a Pulitzer, and we also have J. Randolph Hearst, who is there basically spelling out war with their typesetting. And so you can see that it's by their design that they want war. They're going to print war. They're going to gin up the public to demand for it. So McKinley put out a war message, and he claiming that he wants to put an end to the barbarities against the Cubans. He wants to protect U.S. property and protect the trade between U.S. and Cuba. And importantly, there was something called the Teller Amendment that the U.S. would get Cuba would get political independence. And we'll talk about this debate over what to do with Cuba and these other territories. So in fighting the war, Roosevelt commanded General Dewey to go into the Philippines with a navy. The U.S. defeated the Spanish Navy, but the fight on land took longer. There was a bit of an insurgency there we'll talk about. In Cuba, the army wasn't very prepared. The U.S. Army wasn't very prepared, and more soldiers died of disease in actual combat. There's a famous battle. There's the charge up San Juan Hill, commanded by Roosevelt himself, and there was also an African-American regiment that fought in the battle. Continuing a tradition of African Americans participating in U.S. wars since the beginning. We also annexed, in the context of the Spanish-American War, they annexed Hawaii. Missionaries and entrepreneurs settled there in the mid-1800s. In 1893, settlers overthrew Queen Lulukulani and unjustly, and the war gave McKinley more political clout, and it eventually became a state in 1959. That's something that a lot of people don't realize, that when Pearl Harbor in Hawaii was attacked in 1941, it was not yet a state. So the controversy over the peace treaty. The peace treaty contained Cuban independence, the acquisition of Puerto Rico and Guam, acquisition of the Philippines in exchange for $20 million to the Spanish, and some people were opposed to the taking of the Philippines. Here we see McKinley having to make a decision. Are we going to be anti-expansionist or are we going to be expansionist? And eventually we lead down the right-hand territory where we do take the Philippines and we do take these other territories like Puerto Rico and Guam. So this leads to the Philippine question. Imperialist versus anti-imperialist. To anti-imperialists, this violated the Declaration of Independence, that America itself established independence because of a colonial power, because they were being abused by a colonial power, and then it itself becomes a colonial power. They also didn't like the idea of it entangling the U.S. in Pacific politics. There was also some worry that these foreign peoples, would then be incorporated into U.S. politics in some way, that the Philippines might become a state, and then those people would be considered Americans, but yet they're not white Americans. So we still had that xenophobic, racist attitude there. Within the Treaty of Paris, it did pass by a 2/3 vote in the Senate. The anti-imperialists lost, and we saw the Philippine leader Emilio Aguinaldo was originally fought aside the U.S. for independence, and then he fought a hard-fought battle to maintain that independence, which he did not win. The first cartoon is, we have in 1793, we're a baby growing up and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and for this cartoonist, it's not that America can only step out into the world stage until it, once it has these colonial powers, so that attaining these new territories is necessary for the respect of other European countries. And in this cartoon, we see that McKinley is sizing up Uncle Sam, and you can see very finely written on the pants that he's adding these territories to him, and the anti-imperialists are offering him a little thing that says anti-expansionist policy, and he's offering him a little sip of it, and he declines with thanks. So the anti-imperialists are not being listened to by McKinley or America in general. This is a picture of Emilio Aguinaldo, the one who led the resistance against America in the Philippines. So some other results. We have these things called the insular cases. The question is, do people in acquired territories have rights under the Constitution? Anti-imperialists said yes. Imperialists said no. Supreme Court said no. Congress had the right to grant rights to people within these territories. So it was strictly up to them. And this is where we get into this interesting territory about how the United States has dealt with territorial growth, considering statehood, right? So once we created states out west, there were certain population requirements, and then those people would naturally get folded into naturally get folded into the United States government. But yet the people that were essentially occupied by the US military, did they automatically become a state? Well, the answer is no. The best answer, or the closest they'll get to, is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico becomes a territory. Later on, we'll talk about Puerto Rico. So in Cuba and the Platt Amendment, so U.S. troops were removed as long as they agreed to the Platt Amendment of the negotiation. It said that Cuba would never sign a treaty with another power, which impaired its independence. And it permitted the U.S. to intervene in order to help preserve Cuba's independence. We're going to see that pattern over and over again moving forward. And it allowed the U.S. to maintain a permanent base in Guantanamo Bay. It's something that we still have to this day. And Cuba reluctantly accepted, because it seems like they were just trading one power for another, Spain now for the United States. This picture is highly instructive for how the United States is dealing with all these various groups. So we have Uncle Sam, the teacher, and it looks like he's looking very sternly at the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. In the back, we have the well-orderly and well-behaved states. And up on the board, it has some instruction. In the back, we have a Native American who has his book upside down. And beyond that, we have the Chinese looking to come in. Should they come in? Should they not come in? We'll talk about that. And of course, on the top left here, we can't ignore the fact that this person is not even entitled to be sitting down amongst the other nations and other states. They're confined to doing labor work. So again, it brings in a lot of the world context, as well as some of the other issues that the United States was dealing with at the time. If I get a better resolution picture, we can see the U.S. must govern its new territories without their consent until they can govern themselves. Very, very indicative. So this is in the election of in 1900, McKinley with Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt serving as vice president, versus William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was an anti-imperialist, and he again wanted that gold and silver from the populist platform. And the success of the war in the acquired territories led McKinley to a bigger victory than he won in 1896. What we do see is this is a sectional issue, right? The Democrats are in the solid South. We do get some votes out west, but it's still Republican territory up north. So within McKinley, Secretary of State John Hay was worried that European countries would dominate over China, so that he advocated for this open door policy, where he was convincing other European nations that the U.S. should be able to trade with China freely. So again, it's a little bit more taking a bigger role in the world amongst other nations. In response to this, we have the Boxer Rebellion. Chinese nationalists and xenophobes form a secret society called the Society of the Harmonious Fists, or the Boxers. They attack settlers and Christian missionaries. U.S. sent in troops to quell the rebellion. So this put China in a worse position than they were before, and they had to pay money in reparations. Roosevelt's big stick policy. So McKinley is assassinated by an anarchist, and Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. The big stick policy was this idea that you walk softly and carry a big stick. Basically means that you want to have the show of force, the ability to intimidate lesser countries or countries that you think are lesser in order to get your way. And what we see here is on the ships, we see debt collector, we see the deceiver. Interesting. So parading these boats around Latin America with his policy. So with this big stick policy, the U.S. wanted a Panama Canal that was able to connect the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific, so you don't have to go all the way around South America. Colombia controlled the isthmus, and Roosevelt orchestrated a revolt, promising support of the U.S. Navy. So once Panama got independence, the U.S. got the canal. So a lot of this is seen as, one of the many instances where the U.S. is manipulating other countries for their own benefits. And so Roosevelt issues the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that Roosevelt promised to intervene in Latin, like not only just that they would protect Latin America from European interests, but they would actually intervene if Latin American countries couldn't pay their debts. So you see here, he actually says it says debt collector on one of the ships. And over the next 20 years, the U.S. sent troops to Haiti, Honduras, Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. Within East Asia, we start to see the ascent of Japan, and so Roosevelt negotiates a peace treaty between Russia and Japan, and due to the racism that was taking place in California, Japanese students were being segregated. Japan protested that their citizens were being treated this way in Japan, and so what happens is that the Roosevelt has this gentleman's agreement with Japan, where Japan limited the number of migrant workers sent to California, and Roosevelt lifted the discriminatory practices. This should sound familiar to like some of the issues that we were seeing with the Chinese Exclusion Act back in 1882. Is that there was an Asian group coming in, they were working, establishing a community here, and there was a successful shutdown of their migration. But because of the status of Japan, they were able to negotiate for better terms for the Japanese living in California. Roosevelt built a new Great White Fleet, and Japan welcomed them in Tokyo Bay. And we even went further to have this something called the Route Takahira Agreement, and where basically that Japan and the United States recognized each other's territories in the Pacific so they wouldn't step on each other's toes. So out goes Roosevelt, in comes Taft. Taft did not follow in Roosevelt's footsteps. So he hands off his policies to Roosevelt, taking his big stick with him out the door. He supported U.S. enterprises abroad with the so-called dollar diplomacy, that private investment was actually led to stability. He made investments in railroads in China, and he actually went as far as to send U.S. Marines to protect American investments in Nicaragua, and those troops stayed until 1933. So there was some military intervention there. Woodrow Wilson comes into power in 1912. Democrat Wilson opposed the dollar diplomacy and the big stick policy, and he had Williams Jennings Bryan as his Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State, if it hasn't been made clear yet, is the person who deals with foreign nations, is the foreign negotiator. And so he was able to get the Jones Act of 1916, which gave Filipinos the Bill of Rights and voting, and it promised them independence. That's why they're still not a territory of the United States today. In Puerto Rico, they gave them American citizenship status and a limited self-government, right? So Puerto Rico are American citizens, but they don't have the representation that they the same representation as, let's say, a state. And they had a series of what are called conciliation treaties, and where Brian negotiate treaties to settle these international disputes. And there would be a limited military action imposing a cooling off period. So in this cartoon, it's trying to say that, trying to steer between intervention and war, and with the guiding shining light of justice, right? So he takes a little bit more hands-off approach, except for Mexico. So Wilson was much more aggressive with Mexico and the Caribbean. There was a military dictatorship in Mexico under General Victorino Huerta, and following Huerta taking power, Wilson called in for an arms embargo against Mexico, and then sent in a fleet to blockade the port of Veracruz. There was a resistance against Huerta, and when American troops came ashore to assist that rebellion, they were arrested by Mexico. War was finally avoided by mediation from Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. What eventually happened with this affair is, I have these in the notes. Don't know what happened in the notes. So what ended up happening with Mexico is that once a new power came in, we had Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa was went in and raided Texas and along the Texas and Mexico border. And Wilson actually sent General Pershing at the time, sent a General Pershing down to go after and capture Pancho Villa. But within that campaign of figuring out what happened between Mexico and the United States, we get to World War I. So because of that, Wilson's attention goes to Europe, and he pulls Pershing out to deal with that. World War I is a completely separate issue that we're going to talk about in a later chapter. So this question of economics and imperialism. So most historians at the time stressed that economics was the principal reason for American imperialism, that we didn't really have any political or cultural reasons to go, although that doesn't really hold up, as you'll see. Some business leaders saw intervention as war as a disruptive force, that this is going to make business harder to do in foreign countries rather than easier. Another major force that sort of challenges this idea is yellow journalism that promoted genuine humanitarian motives, that people saw what was happening in Cuba, and by our accounts, they were worried, they were upset about what was happening in Cuba. And so they saw America as a moral force to go in and assist those people. But also, as I showed you in the newspapers, that there was this outrage over what happened to the Maine. That was, again, with not very good evidence. Roosevelt and Wilson were another motivation here for imperialism or more intervention into foreign affairs. That Roosevelt and Wilson were critical of the mediocre Civil War policy, post-Civil War policy, and but we would say that Roosevelt was a more balance of power realist, meaning that he wanted to actually hold the cards and be the biggest, the guy with the biggest stick on the block, whereas Wilson was looking to impose some type of legality and morals to this type of international affairs. That perspective is really going to show up later when we talk about the 14 points. If you're curious about it, you can look up a video on it, but I'll be talking about it later. Historian Richard Hofstadter saw the Spanish-American War as the American people's anxiety over economic depressions, closing the frontier, the rise of big business, and labor radicalism. And I don't know if I necessarily see that. I don't understand why all of these anxieties at home would make people want to pursue these imperialist projects abroad. But the big question here that I started out with in the beginning of the class, or beginning of the video, is to what extent did U.S. intervention in Cuba and the Philippines during the Spanish-American and Philippine-American War represent a change from its previous policy? So how close is this to manifest destiny? Are the economics the same? Are the cultural ideals the same? My hot take on this is that it is incredibly similar. How there were economic opportunities that drove the foreign affairs, both in the manifest destiny and in the pursuit of territories in the Caribbean and in the Philippines, especially as evidenced by the Panama Canal and the access to China. I think that when we look at the cultural impacts here, whereas that didn't get stressed here, is that the cultural impacts is that America, on the one hand, did see themselves as a shining city on a hill that deserved to be spread across the country. And it meant if you ask an imperialist, they may not come out and tell you that commercial business is the goal, but they will say that America is the best thing on the planet, and we deserve to give that gift of democracy and liberty to people around the world. And so that cultural idealism within America, this nationalistic idealism, it was fuel for both Manifest Destiny and for the broader foreign policy in the Spanish American War. All right, guys. So that is chapter 20. I hope you guys got a lot out of it. This was a major turn for the United States, and it's going to get a little bit more thorny as we get into World War II, World War I. And I will talk to you guys soon. Adios. Thank you.